Hi, I'm Ben. Today we're going to be talking with Tim Buckley about the future of design. Hi, Tim. How are you?
I'm good, Ben. Good to be here with you.
So, the topic of the conversation is going to be around the future of design. And specifically, I want to look at the scope in terms of companies which are already established, which might not have an initial digital way of working, and which are considering digital transformations. And I'm really curious about how they implement design in their ways of working. So, to get started, I think it would be nice if you could give us some sort of definition of design and explain to us kind of how it works.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to your point, there's many different kinds of design. So we're not going to be talking about, say, fashion design or architecture of buildings today. We're talking about design in the context of software, right? Making software,
Hmm.
digital products and services. Um, so I think the way I like to kind of introduce this idea to people is that there's a specific subset of design that's been around for, let's say, 20 plus years called human-centered design, which is that design is a special tool that starts with your end customer or your end user of your product, let's say. And it starts with them and then it ends up with a solution for them which works, right? It's going to drive adoption. It's going to be used properly. They're going to love it, and therefore you've got a successful product. That's kind of the meta purpose of design, is to think about the end user and create the solution that fits for them.
So when we talk about UI designers, for instance, UX, etc., what is their role in this?
Yeah, exactly. So within that broad category of design, like why would you even need
Mm.
design if you're building a product? Then yeah, like you say, you've got lots of little subdisciplines. So you've got, say, right at the start, you have a design researcher. The researcher is a specialist in finding the customers, interviewing them, unlocking all the kind of pain points and hidden needs that they've got, and then playing that back to other people. Then you might have, like you mentioned, say, a UX designer. A UX designer might start to think of, oh, well, how do I understand those problems and then start to frame them in the logic of a digital product? Then you also mentioned UI design, so user interface design. That might be more at the kind of visual design that probably pops into most people's heads when they think of design. It's like, design is how something looks, right? So for a UI designer, yeah, that's kind of what they're looking at. Is maybe they're working closely with a UX designer, and now they're starting to translate that vision of what the product could be into an actual visual experience that end user can actually use, right? So the buttons are a certain color. I know where they are because they're in the right place in the product. So it goes from very kind of strategic work, which maybe a researcher or even a service designer is doing, through to quite tactical work, which maybe a UI designer is focused on. But I would say that, yeah, that common misconception that design is always about how something looks is not really the case. And I think digital design has really brought that to the fore, that digital design is it's very much this kind of form follows function thing, right? We want to start with what works for people, and then we get down to the tactical things about colors and, what's the radius on this button, all that kind of nitty gritty visual design.
Uh, and again, so you talk about strategic and tactical perspective. So I
Mm.
imagine that the more a role is strategic and the more domain knowledge is important in their role. Is that correct?
Um, maybe I think I guess we'll come onto this probably later with the context of digital transformation, but I think there are many flavors of creating digital products, and they can be very tactical. It can be that so and so has worked out exactly what product we need, right? Oh, we need this thing, we just need to get it built, and therefore they can move to quite tactical activities, which is like, we know we need these three features, and you'll get in a UI designer to visualize that and then hand that over to a developer to build.
Hmm.
That's a tactical play, right? Strategic is almost saying, well, we don't know what we have to do. We don't know what we're going to build. It may even start with saying we don't even know who our customers are. And then a designer might come in and say, well, are your customers this group of people, or are they another group of people? And then once you define who your customers are, what are their pains and needs? What problems are you solving for those customers? And again, your more strategic designers might go away and work out what those problems are through various activities like interviewing, or kind of more quant things through surveys. So yeah, I think the question of strategy and tactics always comes back to what are you trying to achieve? Are you just trying to crank out a digital product, or are you trying to work out what to do? Yeah, and then I think your question about domain knowledge is, I would say, when you think about something like human-centered design, that is a process that has kind of crystallized over the course of maybe 20 years. And so what good designers are able to do is apply that process to many different domains. So I worked, before I worked more as a consultant, I worked inside an agency or inside a consultancy. And so they would work with many, many different clients, from, IKEA selling furniture to Nespresso selling coffee to, a company looking at, how do they change their organizational design of their company? So many, many different kinds of problems. And the point within that is the same fundamental human-centered process can be applied to many, many different problems. So I think on the one hand, a good designer has probably worked in many different domains, say, I don't know, banking and energy and whatever. But I think you're right that there comes a point where if you're starting a new venture tomorrow and it exists in the banking sector, for example, a designer with prior knowledge of the banking domain is probably going to be more useful to you. What you do see over time, and I'm sure this is the same with developers as well, is certain designers might carve out a niche for themselves, say in the banking sector, in the energy sector, or in the retail sector, or whatever it is. So I think that is quite common. And I think the nature of the kind of work that the industry is increasingly focused on is more and more and more complex. In the early days, it was like, we just need to get online, which is like e-commerce. Like, we used to sell things in a bricks and mortar store. Now let's sell things online. Fine. Whereas today it can be very, very complex issues which are trying to be digitized. So a good example of that is like, very celebrated for like the last 5 years was gov.uk and the government in the UK, how they kind of digitally transformed all of that. Some things on there are crazy complicated, like how do you apply for citizenship and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I do think increasingly that domain specialism is probably coming to the fore as digital transformation is applied to ever more complex and nuanced issues.
What do you think about the correlation and what links design and technology? And something particularly that I like to think is, especially when we talk about UI design, you sometimes have designers who are themselves able to develop user interfaces. And you can also take this at the more organizational and architectural level, where a service designer and an architect, their roles might also be quite similar. And if you want to design a set of services, it's very often important and essential to know about the underlying technology and the way the different services and tools and architecture of the entire organization. So how do you make this?
I think you've hit on that's like a really key point. Almost several years ago, let's say 5+ years ago, maybe some of that was actually a bit easier because the whole industry was a bit less developed, a bit less formalized, and so you had people who were more jacks of all trades, right? So but basically, like in tech, we'll say someone is full stack. In design, you could have someone who is full stack, which means that they're working across many different things. Whereas today, what's happened is that the industry has matured and matured and matured. And so like we said, if you take design, suddenly you've got design research, you've got UI, you've got UX, you've got service design, you've got product design, which may be a blend of those things, probably a few others, right? You've got many different disciplines. And the good thing about that is you've got specialists who are experts in their field. But the bad thing about that is that it starts to create silos where a UXer only thinks about UX, and they stop thinking about, say, the visual side of UI design. And then what you're talking about is that a designer will only think about, well, I'm just here to care about the customer's problems. And the engineer will be like, yeah, but it doesn't matter what the customer's problems are if we can't build this in a robust or efficient way. So I think where there are problems with what you're talking about, it can be that almost the industry is over baked in the sense of it's got too many subdisciplines, and then there's inevitably friction between them. For me, the way I like to, again, like if you're explaining this to your grandma kind of thing, is like building a house. Let's say, Ben, you're a rich guy, you've made your millions, you decide you want to build a fancy house for yourself in the country. Well, yeah, you wish. You're a developer, right? So you know lots of technical things, but you don't know how to build a house. So you probably go to an architect, and then you say, hey, architect, I'd like a pool and a massive garden and whatever. And then the job of that architect is to go away and understand Ben and what Ben wants, and turn that into something that actually works, right? Like the kitchen is next to the utility room and the front door, for example. You don't have like the bedrooms underground and weird things going on. It's because the idea is the architect is an expert in what they're doing. But then the architect isn't enough. Like pretty drawings and nice visuals, which the architect will create for you, that is not, you can't live in those, right? So you need an engineer and you need a builder who's actually going to translate those designs, which are blueprints and visuals, into the real thing that you can live in, so that Ben's dream of living in a nice big house in the countryside has been achieved. And it's exactly the same with design, which is that the designer is in that role of the architect. They're there to extract what Ben wants, imagining you're the end user, and turn that into something that's actually going to work. And so instead of using, say, blueprints like an architect would use, they might use click-through prototypes, for example, to say, hey, does this work for you? Mm-hmm. But then the point is, very quickly in that conversation, the architect has to be good mates with a great engineer and great builders, because they're going to be like, oh, that wall's never going to stand up if you build it that way. And the architect will be like, okay, and then change it. And then eventually they'll come to something that works. And I think it's exactly the same thing. And so within that kind of oversimplified story, you can see the point which you were saying, which is that there must be sympathy between an architect and an engineer. They must each be able to speak each other's language in order for this to work. You can't just chuck your work over the fence and expect the engineer to execute it perfectly. And I think it's the same the other way around. So I think designers need to be kind of slightly au fait with engineering principles, and I think engineers have to be au fait with design principles. And where things work really well is where there's great chemistry between those two, and it becomes like second nature. And that's where all of the stuff that people get sidetracked by, like Jira tickets and all this, it almost melts away, right? Because those two people and their mindsets are quite aligned. So yeah, I think, that I'm kind of painting the ideal scenario, right? Where everyone knows a little about each other's roles. But then the tension within what I'm saying is that what I just said before is that we're working on ever more complex problems, which means we need more specialists. And so the problem, there's this tension, right? On the one hand, we need people who can speak each other's language, but we also need specialists in their field. So I see some fundamental issues with design and technology is around that kind of binary problem.
I'd like to think about digital transformation and also the way it has evolved in the past 20 years. In your mind, do you think that we're doing things better now than before?
Firstly, I'll caveat this by saying that I worked in agencies and consultancies before, and we kind of dabbled around the fringes of major change management or digital transformation projects for companies. But I say in the last 3 to 4 years is where I've been more working in-house in some of these, for example, alongside you. And so I can't say like what was happening 20 years ago in terms of digital transformation, are we better than them? But what my perspective on this is more like digital transformation is a buzzword which we've heard about a lot in the last 5 years and probably bubbled up in the last 10 years. I kind of don't think digital transformation was a thing 20 years ago, right? I think what happened 20 years ago was the first wave of tech-led products and companies, from Microsoft back in the day, through Google, through Facebook, to Airbnb, to the landscape we're in today. They kind of came through and blazed a trail by saying, hey, not only are we digital, but we put our customers first. And the synergy between those two things of like being able to understand our customers and being able to crystallize that in a really accessible digital product has made us very successful. And so what happened is enough of those kind of have come through the pipelines that now, like you said at the start, established companies who've been around maybe even 100 years and never really had a digital presence are thinking, shit, we need to kind of catch up. We need to, these guys are going to take us out of business if we don't start to play in the same arena. And within that, there's so many different reasons, right? They could do it just because they're scared of competition, or they could do it because now they're not cost effective. So digital is just an efficient way of reducing costs. But that's the way I would describe, or the way I articulate to myself, where digital transformation has come from. So when you say, are we doing better than we are 20 years ago? I think it's more that lots of companies have woken up to the fact that this is probably a necessary thing for them to stay alive and relevant. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I see that a lot of things have become commoditized. When we talk about petrol, electricity. And so as a company, if you want to create a competitive edge, you have to differentiate yourself. And we've seen through those companies, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., that digital products are a major differentiator. So you have all those companies trying to jump on board of this digital train and which adopt and reuse the digital products in order to differentiate themselves and to add some additional value to their products. They always, of course, remain anchored in their current business, but the digital angle and those additional services and products that they provide make them competitive.
And I would say, almost kind of bringing it up to date, I would say the broader context I see from being within digital transformation kind of initiatives, if you like, within bigger companies, is today we've got this landscape of so-called disruptors, and let's be honest, they've been around for quite a while. But I would say, Monzo is probably the classic example for banking. Rather than being a Lloyds or a HSBC, you've got a Monzo, which is, it's digitally kind of native. It's putting its customers first. It even does its roadmaps and product development based on what its customers tell it. So you've got that in banking. You've got the same thing going on with things like Bulb and Octopus in the energy sector. Little by little, what you're seeing is the products and services of many industries are just kind of moving through. And so what happens is that the digital transformation projects are almost looking at that and saying, oh, we kind of probably need to do something similar, or we need to, it's almost like they just need to fast track through the last 10 years. It's like, oh, we were kind of caught napping. And now we've got this massive backlog of stuff that we just need to have digitized, like whether they're specific products or whether they're whole services. Because what can happen is those little guys come along and in a few months, they're able to go so far, so fast. I'm sure, again, we'll talk about this when we come onto the kind of organizational stuff. Whereas these bigger legacy companies been around 100 years, they just can't move that fast. They want to emulate the startup success and speed, but it'll never happen. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? They've grown to this massive thing that they're kind of deluding themselves to think that they can really replicate the kind of energy and speed and dynamism of a small disruptor.
Do you know some examples actually of companies which have managed to evolve like this and to embrace design?
I think, I was trying to find, there's a great article on this actually, I was trying to find it before this call to share it with you, but I couldn't find it, so sorry. So you have to bear with my bad summary of it. But it basically says, look, digital transformations, these have been going on for a while, and there's a few different established kind of models of doing it, right? One is you outsource it. You're a big company, you hire one of the big consultancies, the Accentures, the McKinseys, and you say, just go away and do this. Here's a brief, do this for me. And I think lots of people have realized that that's probably not super sustainable, right? It's quite a project-based way of doing things. The other model is you try and bring it in-house and you try and, I don't know, maybe you create a new department within your organization and you kind of build it out from doing that. And then the kind of third way is actually you say, this is never going to work within the confines of our big organization. What we need to do is almost spin up a completely new business or new venture, so it's separated from the legacy of the big company. So the way the big company does things doesn't squash and dilute the way the new company does. And I guess I've been slightly involved in each one of those, probably more involved in that middle one where they're trying to build an in-house competency. But yeah, you asked for a good example. I think one is talking about those disruptors. GIF-GAF, you probably know, is in a kind of mobile operator, so kind of like a telco, modern telco. And they're actually owned by O2, who in turn are owned by Telefonica. But rather than saying, we'll call it like O2 Plus, they said, no, we're going to create a completely new venture. It's called GIF-GAF. It sits outside of the parent organization and it's run in a completely different way. And I think they encapsulate a lot of what I was describing at the beginning about being human-centered and putting customers first, and again, developing their products and services directly hand in hand with constant feedback with their customer. And that's very different to the way that O2 worked as more kind of technical business. So for me, it's kind of examples like that are showing what you described earlier as the strategic approach to design. It's not just hire 20 UX designers and crunch through a load of features. It is saying, we care about digital transformation so much that we're going to start a new business and give it all of the support and love it needs to grow and prove itself, right? And if it doesn't prove itself, we can kill it. And that's the strategic way of making design work, I think, and digital transformation as a whole, because it's not just design. That wasn't just design led. It's tech is a key part of it. Product is a key part of it. But for me, I think increasingly working with you inside some of the other models, you see the pitfalls, right? There are pitfalls in each model, but it's so easy to squash the that new startup culture that you're trying to create if you just sit it within an existing legacy organization, because there are so many forces against it that the chance of it surviving are quite low. Whereas I think if you can do the bold thing of starting that bigger, that external thing, almost as a new venture, a new brand, you'll probably have more chance of success.
So do you think that one of the forces against the adoption of design as a strategic force, do you think one of the elements which holds back company is their current organizational structure?
Yes, in the broad sense, and then no in the sense of we're not. I think when it becomes about at that high level of organizational stuff, it's just about change. If you've got an established organization, it's always hard to change it. So it's not specific about design, like, oh, our organization is made up of, say, technical people and sales people and marketing people, and there's never been a design community there. It's more a case of you're trying to break apart an existing structure and then bring in something new. So whether that's tech or whether that's design, I think there's always going to be a challenge there. But I think is the organizational piece the barrier to making design work? Is if you want to do that strategic piece, you're going to need to think about, well, we've got a C-suite of all these people, but there's no design face there, or tech face, right? Because for whatever reason, engineering's been put over in some delivery center over here, and it's not seen as like the core arm of the business, which might, say, depending on the nature of the business, obviously, might hinge around sales and marketing and these kinds of things.
I believe that a lot of companies having difficulties to go through their digital transformation and to go through the adoption of new ways of working are the ones which have difficulties and a reticence to change. And actually, when you want to adopt those new ways of working, it's not just about changing your organization, your business into a business which will be productive and which will work along that way. It's about incorporating change into your own company culture. The real effort is about saying that we are a company which will constantly change. Maybe we've been able to work in a particular way for decades, hundreds of years, but now it's crucial for us to constantly change and to have rules, to have people who are constantly able to adapt to new ways of working. If you think about the agile methodology, for instance, I mean, evolved drastically in the last 10 years. And you have some rules which are completely new, some ways of working which are completely new. And this impacts the people. This impacts the day-to-day job, the technologies, the tools that they use, the way they interact together. You can't have a company which is constantly at the top in terms of innovation and digital products when you don't incorporate this change culture within your organization.
That's exactly right. And I think the point is digital transformation has become a buzzword. And if you think about it, transformation is a very meaty word. Transformation is like a butterfly, right? It starts as a caterpillar and then suddenly it comes out and it's this completely new thing. And what I think we see is that most companies who say, oh, we're digitally transforming, they don't care. They want to stay as the caterpillar. They don't want to become something else. They just want to be a caterpillar with like an extra few legs or something, you know. So their interpretation of digital transformation is kind of like what I said a bit earlier, which is that they've got a backlog of stuff which they almost feel guilty that they haven't already digitized. So for them, digital transformation is turning that stuff into digital stuff. So it's more of a, in a broader sense, working through a kind of big company backlog of here's some processes and services and maybe products that, let's be honest, we should probably have digitized 10 years ago and we haven't done it yet. Let's create this initiative and call it digital transformation to fast track that process. I would say that's not digital transformation. That is just accelerating probably a natural pattern of work, like, you know, continuous improvement, efficiency savings. These are things that businesses have had to do for hundreds of years. And digital is just one component of that. Digital transformation, which is kind of the context of what we're talking about, which involves design, is saying, how do we change as an organization to being someone that was, you know, maybe we're bricks and mortar or whatever it was, and now digital is going to be at the forefront of how we behave. That is what transformation is about, and that's where design plays its role, because within there is this putting the customer under the magnifying glass, in the sense of, we are going to change as an organization who just cared about our internal shit, like our processes, our technologies. Now we're going to digitize that, and in order to do that competitively, we need to care about our customers, what they do, what they want. And that, again, is the strategic piece. So what I've seen a lot of is companies saying, oh, we're doing digital transformation, but they're not. They're just doing the tactical thing. And that's fine. Maybe that's how they need to get started to get momentum. But I think there's a point where things work or don't work, or they fail or they stop, because the organization cannot make the leap between the tactical mode and the strategic mode. And the problem you see in big companies is, obviously, you might have 2 or 3 people who are super behind it, right? They're completely behind the transformation piece. But, you know, you've got your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss and the CEO, and they're not behind it for whatever reason. Because it takes all sorts of people in an organization to hang together to share that same belief, to transform, to become the butterfly, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's a lot of waffle about kind of broad stuff, but I do think there's a lot of disingenuousness about, we use this term in the industry, and actually, let's be honest, if we look hard under the mattress at like what's going on, probably very few companies are truly digitally transforming, I would say.
If you were to use design as one of those strategic pieces in order to enable the transformation and about change throughout the company, what are some of the skills that you think are missing within those large companies? Like, would bringing maybe a chief design officer be one of the solutions?
Look, certainly there are big companies now who have brought in CDOs, you know, as big kind of things, and I would see that more as a statement of intent, right? It's a flag in the ground to say, we care about design now, and you know, and all the things that kind of come with that. And again, I think that is led by people looking at other companies who have done this before. You know, Apple is the cliche example of this, right? They've been design-led in a slightly different way, I would say, but design has been at the forefront of what they've done kind of forever. And other businesses have always say, you know, I want to be more like that. And so a short track to kind of get there is, oh, we just hire a big senior CDO, and then everything will fall into place. And I would say, yes, I think you need both things. You need top down, which is what we're talking about now, which is the CDO thing. But you also need bottom up, which is that whoever is going to be involved in this digital transformation, it needs to be carrot and stick, top down, bottom up. Everyone needs to be aligned with that new mission of what digital transformation is. So to me, it actually just begins with, what do you want to achieve with your digital transformation? Like, that's the hardest question for most of these companies to answer, is like, what is the good outcome in 5 or 10 years? Is it just that we're still operating? And I think a lot of digital transformation projects start because, like I said, they've got pressure to kind of get through a backlog, to deliver stuff, and then they get into the delivery mode, and then they stop thinking like, what are we even doing? Why are we doing this work? So I think for design to play a kind of instigation piece in terms of how you drive this, I think, yeah, it comes from the business all agreeing that they need to get serious about thinking about their customers and being human-centered. That's the main thing. And then putting someone in charge of that. And it may not be a chief design officer. It may be a chief customer officer who's just, lots of companies have that. And sometimes they sit in a marketing place or they sit in another place, but they just need to be committed to that. And then I think for design to play a role, whoever that senior person is has to be thinking of the design capability that they build as key in achieving that ultimate vision for their company. And then you can get into the nitty gritty of, do I need UI, UX and all this stuff? But I think it all flows from that kind of critical understanding of what you're trying to achieve and commitment from the organization to do that.
So last question before we finish, I wanted to know, where do you think design will go in the future from now, and then how it will develop in those large companies?
I think, look, this is the big question that we're all going to get out our crystal balls and say, "Ooh, what's going to happen in the future?" I don't know. My view is, I think this division that we're talking about, this tactical versus the strategic, will continue to play out. And I think design is not this amazing silver bullet that lots of people think it is, right? They think, oh, if we just have design and whatever that means, like we've got 10 designers and they work on this, lots of these business problems will go away. And I think what happens is companies get disillusioned because that doesn't work. And actually they hire expensive designers, and then the designers don't deliver. And then there's a loss of belief in design. And that stems from what we were talking about before, about what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to set up. Because if you're trying to achieve X and you hire people under the assumption that they're trying to achieve Y, then obviously you're going to be disappointed. So I think what will happen is that companies will be forced to think a bit more strategically, because they'll see that the tactical piece gets you a certain amount up the graph and then it kind of plateaus. And the strategic piece is kind of what we were talking about a second ago, which is that you can't, it's not good enough to just have digital products and services. You as a business must be customer centered, must be digitally first. And that's where I think the future of design is heading. Because I think, these businesses who aren't doing that, they're not the Monzos, the Starling Banks, the Bulb Energies or whatever that we're talking about before. They are the legacy companies, and this is new to them. They will realize that in order for this to be sustainable and to deliver them the competitive edge or value, whatever it is they're looking for, they will need to have that strategic approach. And I do think it's like, I know the purpose of this talk is about design, but design doesn't exist in a vacuum, just as neither does tech or product. It is those three things together in synergy. That's the holy grail. And you always see a company that either over-indexes on design and then under-indexes on product, or over-indexes on tech and forgets about design, for example. So I think design will only be successful in the future if companies start to break the silos between those two things and integrate those really well. And then I think, speaking more from a personal design perspective, I think the future of design is that design has to get a bit more savvy, actually. Like we talked about design understanding tech, but design has to understand business. And I think we're still in the place where lots of designers become very, very good at their craft. And that craft has value in the market, particularly right now, because there's lots of examples of businesses using that craft to create business success. But lots of designers can kind of take that for granted. They can say, well, I'm a designer, so I'm important. And actually what happens is that the designers who are really successful are the ones who can not only they can do that craft, but they can translate that into, this is why you need this. This is why this is going to create value for you. This is how we should be working, i.e. that more strategic business brain that I think has been lacking. And I think there are initiatives out there kind of pushing this. There's more people focusing on, business design is actually a newish discipline. To summarize my waffle, I would say the two things are, companies will suffer with the tactical play in design. It can get you so far, and then that's it. So I think number one is, I think the strategic thing will become more important, and companies will grapple to work out what that looks like. It's not going to be easy. You can't just hire a CDO and say tick. So I think companies will work out what that looks like. And then two, I think in order for that to be seen as a good thing, I think the design industry itself will become much more product business savvy. I think it has to stay alive. Otherwise, to your point earlier, it'll just be commoditized. And actually, there are aspects of UI design and UX design which can just be automated.
Yep.
Quite easily, right? I know this is the similar thing is said about tech, where code will write itself in some magical future world, maybe. I think the same with design. The industry is mature enough now that there are best practices out there. We're not reinventing the wheel as we were, 10, 15 years ago. You're able to get from 0 to 10 pretty fast, and then it's how do you do the next bit. So I think designers will need to find that extra edge. And for me, that extra edge is around really aligning your design work with business goals. And it sounds a bit cold, but I just think that's life. For design to become accepted and to really kick on to that next step, to find that strategic place, it needs to be able to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. That was a very nice conversation we had, and I learned quite a lot.
No, thank you. My pleasure.
Cheers.